Welcome to ToK Today. This is the second part of a three-part series in which we draw upon the knowledge and wisdom of Craig Davis. He's head of school at Mulgrave School in Vancouver. Craig is a highly experienced ToK teacher. He has also been a ToK workshop leader and served on the ToK curriculum group. So we're very fortunate to have him with us on ToK Today. Now, I've linked the first video in the series above, and in that video, Craig explains some of the unique insights and understanding that Indigenous knowledge systems can bring to our ToK learning. And at the start of this video, I've asked Craig about approaches to teaching Indigenous knowledge systems. So in this video, we get more into the pedagogy and practice. Craig starts by recommending a video as an entry point into teaching IKS, and that's enough from me. Let's go straight over to Craig.
The Wade Davis TED Talk is a really good entry point, and he talks about in that very famously the indigenous group in the Amazon, the Kofan, who, when he was visiting, when he had this ludicrous job title of explorer in residence at the National Geographic, which gave him carte blanche to wander the world, but was really interested in how this group, who have lived embedded in the central part of the Amazon, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of different flora and fauna, how they'd been able to find the ayahuasca plant to use, shamanically in a ritualized way, but you can't ingest the ayahuasca plant unless you find an MOA enzyme inhibitor. Otherwise, you just throw up, and it doesn't. And there's only one plant that plays that role in neutralizing it. And he was, he's an ethnobotanist going, I apply my Harvard scientific method here to trial and error and classification and that systemic, right? And there's no way you would ever even get there by trial and error because of the density. How do you know? And they just say, well, you stupid. We just, on the night of a full moon, we sing a song and we ask the plant and they tell us where to find the other plant. Are you stupid? And joke in the TED Talk, but saying here's a clash of two systems of knowledge. And what is powerful about what he says there, and that's our entry point with our Squamish approach here, and it's the same thing we learned from the elders here. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, because the fact is, in many indigenous systems, the metaphor is truth. They don't have that separation of objective truth and then myth. It's conflated because there's a centralized understanding that everything is narrative, including our perception of reality. Everything is narrative. And that's when it gets really interesting, because then you bring in connections to cognitive psychology. And Professor Donald Hoffman at the University of California, who famously wrote his book recently and is getting more and more traction about the case against reality, is looking at perceptual science and recognizing we don't actually perceive anything that's real. And then you get into quantum mechanics and recognize when you start breaking down the smallest building blocks, atoms and electrons, and then, well, there's nothing really there. It's information. And so there are these interesting touch points to say how having that kind of traditional narrative view, whether you're believing that the world is stacked on the back of 11 turtles, or whether you're looking into into quantum cosmology, there's similarities in some of the conclusions that ignite students' thinking. It's not that you have to be a philosophy student or into all those big grandiose pieces, but it's becoming more and more interesting as people become more and more aware of indigenous approaches and realizing, okay, there's something in this. Maybe they got it right 10,000 years ago in the way in which they articulate.
But I've also started to read Graham Hancock, a very controversial character. Hancock is, I don't know if you've heard of him, but
yes, I have, yeah.
A historian who says that the sort of the framework and perspective of academic history is wrong or has overlooked things. And he's looked a lot at Davis's work on linguistics in the Amazon and processes around labeling, classification, and knowledge creation and knowledge loss. Sort of interesting. And Hancock's work also links directly with maps, because he's done a lot of stuff on lost maps, new maps, and that obviously links with the map is not the territory. So yeah.
He's I've engaged with his work over the years, and he's a good case study for ToK students, because I think there's lots in what he says which is really interesting, but there's lots that's also very dubious. That a good ToK student will look at confirmation bias and selection bias. He's very fixated on this notion of the precession of the equinoxes, and that there was a ancient civilization about 12,000 BC that is the originator of everything. And I think that's the bit I'm very skeptical of, because that's someone who's fixated on proving and selecting and confirming anything that might prove that. But along the way, he does have a lot of value in engaging with knowledge approaches and systems which we don't always get access to, and he's really good with that. And I think that's a very interesting way of engaging with it. And he has that book Supernatural, which is about his own experiences with ayahuasca and engaging with the same kind of cultures and traditions.
I think he's someone who is useful to look at as someone who sits outside of the accepted discipline, or outside the boundaries of the convention, outside of the scope, to use the ToK methodology, and therefore is rejected by those within the scope and within the accepted methods. And whether he is correct and he's going to move history forward or not is not really relevant here. It's that idea of the sort of outsider who is disrupting or could potentially disrupt the discipline. And Professor John at Princeton is another example that I use on that as well, who did work on psychokinesis in his physics lab, which didn't go down too well.
So this is important stuff that I think is often overlooked in ToK generally. I think indigenous knowledge is part of it, but also religious knowledge systems that was tried and then consigned, is that the key difference between training people in being very, very good critical thinkers and being able to, detect the baloney, as Carl Sagan would say, and that element of the course, which is still crucial, even more crucial these days with misinformation, disinformation, and but how doing that doesn't then lead to a form of radical skepticism where you don't entertain anything that doesn't fit into a very, very rigorous form of scientific methodology. And it's knowing when there's a difference, and the best ToK can enable students to recognize that. Yes, I love the phrase that there's always better answers. You always have to be rigorous in thinking about complicating and challenging and counterclaim, counterclaim, the counterclaim, and that's great thinking. But then also having the intellectual humility, which is where IKS and the old religious knowledge system would come in to say, okay, this is a different way of thinking. And I always think there was an overlap between Karen Armstrong, the famous theologian professor at Oxford, who in her TED talk, and it connects with to indigenous knowledge, was saying, look, in religious knowledge, it's not propositional. It's not propositional knowledge. It was never propositional knowledge. It only became that way after the Enlightenment, when more traditional scholars and clerics, both imams and rabbis and priests, were trying to defend religion on the same terms as Enlightenment science, by trying to say that the Bible or the Quran was literally true, when it was never considered to be literally true. It was always symbolic, and faith as a knowledge system was more around what you did. It's procedural. It's about a position and engaging with that. And so that was the bit that I found really interesting, because that also gave an entryway into indigenous practices that to say it doesn't. If you only evaluate them through that lens, then you're missing a whole aspect of knowledge. And the IB mission, again, which I'm saying we are tasked with really engaging with completely radical different ways of thinking and being and behaving. And I think that was something that I felt was a bit sad that we lost that, because of course it's very difficult. And it's mindful of people watching this, is that wherever you are in the world, what you associate with indigenous or what you associate with the word religion, can also just be like, okay, I'm not going near that. That's just something that's too difficult to engage in. It's, and I think that right now we need to engage with it, because I think it's ripe in terms of the recognition that, the more and more people are understanding the process of knowledge development from the Enlightenment onwards, which has played a part in some of the challenges we're now facing. It's been amazingly positive in every way, but there's also limitations. And this is an opportunity to explore the limits, not explore woo, not to give airtime to stuff which is clearly just bogus, but actually to engage with things on their own terms, which means doing a little bit more work to engage with what those terms are.
Absolutely. As you're speaking, my mind is blowing up with ideas for what the core could look like in terms of knowledge systems, but that's very sort of intangible in many ways. For teachers and students that are watching, I want to sort of bring it to more tangible things. You've talked about using Wade Davis's work in teaching IKS. Are there any other good resources that you could recommend, or even better, ideas for teaching IKS that you've used that sort of work perennially and you come back to over and over again?
Yeah, there's a great organization in this part of the world called FNESC, FNESC, and it's easy to search up, and they are the educational partners in terms of making sure that Indigenous knowledge, and a contextual Indigenous knowledge in Western Canada is taught through the entire provincial curriculum. So there's a huge number of resources there that are relevant. What my students have done in this space, for their exhibitions, is looked at totemic art. They've looked at Indigenous art from Haida Gwaii. They've looked at the artistic approach to totemic art, for example, which is a concrete one. And that is that the totem pole that most people would probably know, in one version of it, is carefully constructed to be the trunk of a tree, which only has very subtle indentations that look a little bit like a bear or a raven or a frog. And the idea being that you're training the young mind to see the face of the bear, the frog, and the orca in all trees. So the word animate is an indigenously relevant term, which is how art has a different purpose, because there isn't a distinction between the creator and the viewer. They collapse the subject-object divide, because art is everything, because it's just a reflection of the natural world. So that's where biomimicry comes in. And that's really interesting stuff to get into, because it's quite tangible to look at how art has a different purpose and a different role, which actually transcends both art but also human science, as a project. There is lots in connection there to work I used to do at Tanglin School with my friend Mark Bradshaw, who was at UWC, which was looking at the relationship between music and ToK. And he was an ethnographic musicologist. He went to SOAS, and he's very, spent a lot of his time in Africa. And we're talking about exactly the same thing in many African musical cultures, where there isn't a sense of a stage or a performance, because art is just integrated into everything anyone does. And so you can see very quickly, when you look at particular examples in Indigenous knowledge, you very quickly get to interrogating the very fundamental precepts that we have in the way we define. So the notion of a gallery or exhibition in art is dismantled, because that's not what art is. That's why right now the sociological element would be the fact that people are going, why are we these totem poles in all these museums across Canada or around the world? Let's get them out of these ludicrous contexts and put them back into their original context, which is where it's meant to be, something you engage with on a daily basis, and it's just part of who you are.
Wonderful. I love the practical aspect of looking at totemic art, and for the students to be able to develop some of those skills or to practice some of those ideas in their own environment, in their own school, with real physical things, which is part of the mission here of ToK today, is to get ToK from out of desks and behind screens and reading textbooks, and actually get it to be a physical, practical thing of moving around in the world, doing ToK, trying to do it. I hadn't made the connections between the idea of breaking down object subject in art to then leading into implications for science and human sciences. That's potentially huge.
Yeah, that's, and even though we try to make sure that ToK isn't a philosophy course, and you try and ensure that you're breaking it down for all students, and let's not get too abstract. I do have students who happen to be taking philosophy who run with this from Indigenous knowledge, and they really go into then they go into idealism. So if anyone has that context, if you look at the philosophical tradition of idealism, it's completely aligned with some of the findings from Indigenous knowledge and art. Which is where you completely reject the Cartesian notion of subject and object, and you completely reject the notion of of material reality and non-material reality. Everything is a representation. And then that's also then the argument from Donald Hoffman as a cognitive neuroscience and mathematician. And that's what my mathematicians have been totally into. Again, I'd recommend that TED Talk by Donald Hoffman. It's a good 20-minute private. Do we see reality as it is? And of course, that gives different access points in the core theme as well. But I'm just saying it resonates with an Indigenous approach, which is that there's an intrinsic recognition that everything is narrative because everything is constructed, and therefore you don't have that same concern around, we've got to analyze what's real. And the way we've done it in Mulgrave, the students said, look, the scientific method is still 100% important. One of the most important tools in ToK, because the extrapolating those things is really good way of differentiating misinformation. But then what Indigenous knowledge says is, okay, you do that, but recognize that it's still a system. And it's, don't mistake the scientific method as a tool for a metaphysics. That's the difference. And so I do think sometimes you do have to teach some of those terms, and they're not hard. It's not, it's not high level philosophy. What does metaphysics mean? What does your worldview mean? That's what makes Indigenous knowledge very relevant to the climate action agenda and sustainability, because I think it's what most people here are saying. You can't do climate action unless you're interrogating the very foundations of your worldview. Otherwise, it's not actually going to work. And we had a professor here from Cambridge, Janice Lau, who's a mathematician, and she was saying, for the climate crisis, the math isn't mathing. That, and it's a bit like the current, Pythagoras quote for one of the essay titles, numbers are everything. That's what my students have used to say, obviously, we're not able to deal with this crisis using certain knowledge systems. We need other knowledge systems to be able to push the needle on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been reading some interesting stuff on the behavioral economics of the climate crisis. You couldn't come up with a more perfectly anti-behavioral economics problem than the climate crisis. The idea that you have to take some altruistic action to benefit the greater, which will have no benefit to you, well, no tangible immediate benefit to you, and will quite probably reduce your utility or your quality of life.
And there you go. And that's the 7th generational principle again. It's embedded into Indigenous practices in this part of the world that you must have a long-term view of at least 7 generations. It would remove asset stripping from business practices. It would remove the 4-year election cycle of politicians. It would, you extrapolate that principle, and it would solve most of the problems we have. And that short-termism is the issue. The way they frame it here, and it was another exhibition topic, was the pivoting towards your ancestors. So it's very, very prevalent. It's not just unique to Indigenous cultures. I also think immediately of Hong Kong and China. The context of being very, very attuned to your ancestors and recognizing them. Now, of course, when you do that and you recognize and you introduce yourself on stage as I am, the great great granddaughter of, and you go through your lineage, it then enables you to then project forward to say, how do I conduct my life as a good ancestor? I want to make sure that when my great 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 great, that they could come back and say, this is a lineage of stewarding everything to make it perfect for those people 7 generations down the line. You can't live that principle without interrogating everything around knowledge. and value systems.
Yeah, a huge sort of implications there for a lot of the things that our students are studying in their diploma. You mentioned the exhibition, so if we could just move on and have a talk about the sort of tangible links between Indigenous knowledge systems and the exhibition that you might have seen coming from your students. Just to give a little bit of background on this, I've said often, somewhat controversially, that I'm not sure that the ToK exhibition actually links with the optional themes. And I've seen students struggle trying to link their exhibition to optional themes. And I've sort of teach the exhibition, linking it to the knowledge framework of the AOKs more closely, and I don't mention the optional themes. So I bring you in, Craig, as an alternative voice, as an advocate for linking the exhibition to Indigenous knowledge systems, and to show that it can be done, and that my view is limited at best.
Yeah, the examples I've given you are the ones that have been used for exhibitions, whether someone's been looking at an image of a totemic art, or describing an experience of visiting the Anthropology Museum at University of British Columbia, which has got some of the most incredible examples of Coast Salish art, and whether it's people using the clash of systems like we saw with the Kofan, and saying, our system is that the flowers sing to us on the night of a full moon, versus the taxonomies of ethnobotany. Those are the types of exhibition examples that are used, in that, and I would agree with you. Yeah, I'm maybe I'm careful about what I say here, because I don't quite know whether there's any penalization, whether someone who's marked or moderated the exhibitions has looked at that. But we spend more time making sure that people respond to the prompts. The prompts are the hardest things to really focus the student onto. What does that prompt mean? How do you stay true to that prompt? And how do you create 3 really good examples that then develop that thinking? And that's probably why I'd say, to promote it, the Indigenous examples have been very, very commonly used, because people tend to find a space for them in many different kinds of prompts. And so there's always a prompt around, the prompt around culture, for example, is an obvious one. But there's also other prompts that enable you to be able to talk about the boundaries of good critical thinking and information literacy when it's useful, but then when you also need to push those boundaries a little bit and looking at Indigenous knowledge, or Graham Hancock, or anyone else you might be looking at. So I think it has that practical element. I would say yes. Talking abstractly about the poor, I think there shouldn't be strict policing of the examples that are used. If saying, okay, it doesn't technically fall into any of the themes, that's really an AOK theme. I would hope that exhibition moderators would be looking at the quality of thinking in response to the prompt.
Yeah, there's no penalization for not linking it to a theme. It doesn't mention the theme in the assessment instrument. It's only a recommendation made by IB. The prompts that I see most students have trouble with is does some knowledge belong to particular communities of knowers? And typically with that prompt, what I see is, here is a kimono, it belongs to Japanese people. Here is a hamburger, it belongs to American people. Here is a Morris dancer, it belongs to English people. And of course, the prompt isn't really about the particular communities of knowers. It's about the word belong. And what does belong mean? And different ways that we could understand belong. Did they produce the knowledge? Have they interpreted the knowledge? Have they reinterpreted it in different ways? Do they use this in a way that wasn't intended for, and so on and so on? And I wonder whether Indigenous knowledge systems gives us new ways to think of how knowledge might belong. A sort of take it from the knower's perspective rather than necessarily from the producer's perspective, or from a sort of external framework or structure.
That's really perceptive, Daniel, because I think, yeah, it reminded me to mention that, because that is distinctive in certainly the indigenous knowledge systems where we are, meaning, Coast Salish, West Coast Canadian. One of the principles of learning from the First Peoples is learning involves recognizing that some knowledge is sacred and only shared with permission and or in certain situations. Now, that addresses some of what you've said, because it talks about the fact that if knowledge and learning has to support the well-being of the self, the family, the community, the land, the spirits, and the ancestors, then there's a different relationship to permission and sharing, not in a proprietorial way that we would understand it through a Western lens, which is about, oh, this belongs to us, you've got to pay us for it. It's actually around it being misunderstood, or not the misappropriation that we're concerned about, oh God, we're going to get cancelled, or we're doing it wrong. It's more about the fact that knowledge is sacred. It's not something you can always just throw around willy-nilly. It's actually something that is very powerful. So again, using the indigenous lens, it gives you a different angle into that notion of belonging. When we visited the Ewekino Nation, and also our systems transformation pathway students, who we've just launched that course, we started it by going up to a place called near Bella Bella in the central BC coast, and went to the Ewekino Nation and went into the longhouse. And when you go into the longhouse, the big house in an indigenous community, you're in a sacred space. You have to walk in a certain way. You are very careful not to share anything that's shared with you in the big house unless it's with permission. And then they spoke about the fact that different families have different knowledge sacred to them that they would only share in certain situations. And that's also around how they make masks and how they create the totems and how they do different designs. So that is a rich vein of inquiry for ToK students to look at that. It will be very different again in Australia or New Zealand or Finland or Malaysia or Japan or anywhere else where there's distinctive indigenous groups. But I think that probably would be something that was common. There would be a different take on it, which would give you something unique and interesting to say in your exhibition that probably, would be of interest to somebody reading it. That, oh wow, that's interesting. Because the role and the purpose of knowledge is constantly centralized in indigenous knowledge. What is its purpose? And we don't have that. We think about knowledge largely as something which is abstracted, put in the textbook, and accessible to all. So yeah, I think it's I don't have answers, but these are just provocations that we look at, and people have used them, and they've used their own experiences of like that. They've got up to that particular village and remembered what the hereditary chief told them, and said, okay, that's maybe think about forms of knowledge, belonging, sacrilegious knowledge, etc.
Another prompt that I see some difficulties with, which I think could link to Indigenous knowledge systems, is the one about current knowledge being the product of its historical development. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's about current knowledge and historical development. And I often see the answer sort of says, this is an iPhone 17 and it was developed from an iPhone 16, which was developed from an iPhone 15. Rather than looking at the different ways in which knowledge may develop over time and the reasons why knowledge may develop over time. I think, as an aside, I do think that the exhibition does push students towards sort of material objectification of the world. That's another issue that we'll come to. I think that Indigenous knowledge systems could possibly offer students a response to that prompt, which might be something along the lines of, you can't separate current knowledge from its historical development. There is, the past, the present, and the future are one continuous sort of flexible dynamic. And
yes, and that's exactly right. And which is why, again, this is great for ToK teachers out there, because you're going through those prompts and you're illustrating that there's always an interesting take from the Indigenous perspective. Yeah, you're absolutely right. As far as I know, and I can't speak for, I hope in this conversation that no one gets the impression that I'm any kind of expert. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm not part of an Indigenous group, but I'm absolutely excited and engaged in this area of inquiry. But from what I can tell, listening to, say, Elder Flo Williams, who's an elder who works with us here at Mulgrave, and talking about that very concept about how in oral traditions where that knowledge is passed on, every generation, of course, that's an interesting way of thinking about in orality what are the things that are continuous and what are the things that would change, and in the fact that that's not even a concern. It's not like the Squamish people or any other indigenous community that has primarily an oral transfer of knowledge. Doesn't really have a concern about slippage or change or development in that transfer, because it's really based around principles and approaches, and it's really based around narrative and story. So if you've got a narrative and story foundation to knowledge, does that then change the concern you might have around a different form of knowledge development, like the scientific method, which iterates based upon there's a consensus until it's challenged, and then that consensus is challenged, and it changes, and versus the more literal iPhone upgrades every year. That's exactly what you want in an exhibition, is two or three very different takes on the same subject that give you different insights. And I would say there is more of a conflation and a collapsing of time when you've got a knowledge system that doesn't really have a concern around linearity in the way that we may have grown up with Gregorian calendars and the development of time in the way that it has been framed in the West. And if you have a notion of the eternal being just central in everything, again, it disrupts that notion of linear time in a way that changes the knowledge. And I would also say, my interest on this one came through Marshall McLuhan, a communication professor from the University of Toronto in the 1960s. He wrote The Global Village, and he first looked at, oh God, he was predicting the internet, but he was doing it through indigenous knowledge by saying that when you look at oral cultures, the way in which knowledge is transferred is more in common with what we're seeing will happen with computers. And of course, there was initially, when the internet came out, this global village triumphalism. Oh my God, everyone's going to be connected. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be like, the democratization of knowledge. And then we didn't realize then that the corporations quickly moved in and killed that.
Marshall McLuhan, the media is the message.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant. We could go on looking at each of the exhibition prompts and interpreting them in terms of indigenous knowledge. You certainly started to convince me that the indigenous knowledge systems can really contribute to the exhibition and doesn't necessarily complicate the exhibition. So you shifted my thinking in ToK again, Craig. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to leave this video off there. In the next video, we're going to talk about IB Systems Transformation, which is a new course coming to the IB diploma. It's an amazing course, and they are piloting it at Craig's school. So be sure to tune in to find out more about IB Systems Transformation. So I'd like to thank Craig very much for all of his time in this video and look forward to the discussion in the next video. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this. Please like, comment, and subscribe. See you on the next one.